Hello everyone, and a warm welcome to this session on uncovering hidden pockets of climate finance. I'm Komal Sahu, Chief of Sustainable Finance at AVPN. It's great to have you with us today. You'll be excited to know that we have over 100 people in the room and more are joining as we speak. AVPN is a network of funders and resource providers with over 600 members across 32 markets. Our mandate is to move more capital towards impact in Asia by providing social investors like yourselves opportunities to connect, learn, and lead. I will be your MC for this session. My role is to ensure that your experience in the next hour is a meaningful one. If you find that my voice or video is lagging, it may be due to internet bandwidth issues. It may help to log out and log back in. If you're facing any other technical challenges, such as difficulties in hearing the speakers, please do not hesitate to reach us through our email at avpn.asia. We will address your queries as soon as we can. We advise you not to surface your tech questions on the chat room as it's solely for content discussion. Before we kick off our session, I'd like to highlight a few features of this room. Please note that this session will be recorded and you will be able to access the recording from conference.avpn.asia. After the session starts, please feel free to share any comments or questions you have using the chat function. We advise you not to use this chat box to surface any technical questions you may have, as that will disrupt the session flow. We will have time for Q&A, so do stay with us until the end of the session. Feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box, and we will convey these questions to our speakers. You can also upvote the questions posted by others if you would like that question to be answered. Upvoted questions have a higher chance of being picked up by the speakers. Due to the time constraints, the speakers may not be able to respond to all your questions. Rest assured, we're monitoring this behind the scenes and we'll try and address as many of them as possible. Throughout the session, there will be interactive activities for you to participate in, and I will be on standby to guide you through those. Finally, to continue chatting with your speakers and fellow delegates at this session, please make sure you're making full use of the AVPN connector. The link can be found in the chat. There's also a 1-minute tutorial on the conference website if you want to make full use of the networking opportunities. Before I hand over the mic, we would like to get to know the audience better. Please take time to fill out the poll. There are 3 questions, so please do scroll down. We have a number of foundations and trusts and other organizations in the room. We also have some banks, some multilateral organizations and corporates as well. Plus, I can see some impact funds in there as well. We have 78% of people in the room interested in climate finance, which is wonderful to see. By the way, we do have a climate finance platform, so please do log into that and connect for deals as well as for learning. What are the current roadblocks to mobilizing climate finance? A lot of people are talking about lack of investable opportunities. Perhaps this is an opportunity to learn what types of investable opportunities there are throughout the session. Thank you. So before we get to our panel discussion with our 3 panelists, Maud Savari-Mornay, Regional Director, Asia Pacific Responsibility, Dr. Pushkala Lakshmi Ratne, Climate Finance Lead at International Finance Corporation, and Dr. Paiyuan Guo, Chairperson at Sintao Green Finance. I would like to introduce and welcome our moderator for this session, Yosef Zahar, the Senior Climate Finance Advisor, SEI Associate at the Stockholm Environment Institute. Yosef Zahar is an SEI Associate focused on climate finance and the role of private finance in addressing community mitigation and adaptation challenges. Welcome to the panel, Yossi, and the mic is now yours.
Thank you very much, Komal, and hello, everybody. I welcome our distinguished panel. I think that we have a wonderful group here, also diversified geography. We are all focused on Asia Pacific, but based in different locations, and bringing the perspectives of multilateral IFC, an impact fund by responsibility, which is the most active climate impact fund in the region, and of course from the perspective from China, which is so important to the region. Just as an intro, this session will discuss innovative solutions to attract new private sector players. More funds from institutional investors needs to find a way to the region to support the transition to low carbon, climate resilience. Philanthropy and dedicated funds can take the lead. And I think that the AVN platform is really aimed for that. And I really hope that this will be an outcome of this session and the conference. And that is especially through blended finance solutions that we will discuss. In terms of instruments, green and sustainability bonds are already there. And just yesterday, ICMA has updated their sustainability bond principles, or actually issued ones, which are very important for the sustainability bond market. But the way it is now, climate finance does not yet reach the vulnerable communities in the region, in Asia Pacific, adaptation and resilience programs, which are very much so important for the whole agenda of climate. So yes, infrastructure projects are being financed with green bonds, and the involvement of the sector has been very important over the last 2-3 years. But how do we actually channel those funds also to those pockets where it's needed most, in fact? Is blended finance the silver bullet in a way? What are the associated challenges? Why it is so difficult for private sector to access these areas? We will discuss all of that, perhaps the role of carbon finance in the region, which is coming kind of back again. What is needed to enable this? And we have, of course, touched the current crisis. We're not living in a bubble, and something drastic has happened. And we need to understand, how does that affect our market? How does that affect green finance? And I will perhaps start with this topic. So I'd like to refer questions to our panelists. And we are at uncertain times, COVID crisis. Everybody's talking about stimulant packages. It's a transformational shift in leadership thinking. The key question is how are we? What do the panelists view? I mean, is this an opportunity for green finance, or in fact it will put it aside? How can we actually channel the perhaps opportunity, the stimulant packages towards the green? And I would like to first refer the question to Pushkala. So what is, from the MDB's DFI's perspective, what is the role and the response for COVID, and how could you actually bring together a private sector to join you on that response?
Thank you very much, Yossi. And thank you to ABPN as well for inviting IFC and me today to the panel. No, I think it's a very relevant question given what's happening here, as we talked about in your introduction as well. I think this is an enormous opportunity in a way to rethink a lot of the investments that are going into climate. And we have seen this now in the last couple of months from the IFC side. So just to put it in perspective, in terms of the market itself, I think a lot of people are starting to realize that climate risk is in parallel or almost equivalent to what we're seeing in the pandemic in terms of shock. And physical and transition risks around climate have been an important topic, but are probably, excuse me, gaining a lot more prominence now with people just seeing how this affects economies and markets and companies as well. So there is a change in sentiment, I would think, but of course, this, a lot of this has to be top down with policy and regulation coming in and ensuring that the investments or climate investments are heading in the right direction during the recovery period. And there's a lot more focus, I think, as we're starting to see in terms of sustainable infrastructure and high quality infrastructure as we move into the recovery phase. From the IFC side, we have the World Bank Group and IFC. We've put together a COVID response facility for a number of our clients as well, which is a pretty large facility directed towards liquidity concerns that a number of our clients are facing, and the response has been enormous. And from our side, from my side as well, on the climate side, we find that working capital facilities or trade facilities which are related to climate are as important for this part of the facility that we are working on, and we're seeing a lot of response. And going forward, in terms of long-term funding, it's going to be more important than ever before, I think, for climate. And this is a huge opportunity, as I said, as a group, to come together on the private sector side, but also as a World Bank group on the policy and regulation side as well.
Thank you very much. Pushkala, can I ask you a follow-up question? How do you see in developing Asia, where the priorities are food security and jobs, can governments actually prioritize green as a response from COVID? I mean, or sustainability? Could this actually go hand in hand?
Absolutely, Yossi, and that's a perfect question because we get that asked a lot pre-COVID and now even during COVID. And I think, we have done a little bit of an analysis internally as well, and we find that there are so many renewable energy sectors, energy efficiency sectors, and jobs that are related to that, which are probably going to come to the fore more than any of the, say, the traditional, power generation of sectors or industries that we see. So I think it's a huge opportunity, not only from climate in the sustainability perspective, but also in terms of the economic impacts of what would come about because of increased climate lending and investments. And definitely job creation, definitely stability around those, food security and growth are all factors that we're starting to see will be positively affected by this change in climate investments.
Thank you very much and very much hope that the region will be the response, and I think the kind of the leadership change in thinking can provide that. I'd like to refer the same question to Maud, and Maud, I know that responsibility, of course, is very much in the region, working with financial institutions, bringing impact funds. Could you maybe describe the recent response for the COVID? And I know that you've been part of a consortium of few impact funds together. You may need to.
Sorry, I'm there. Sorry for that. Yes, thank you so much for giving me the floor. Maybe I would like to introduce myself first and responsibility, if you don't mind, and then moving to your question on COVID and what are the current initiatives. As for responsibility, as you may know, it's an asset manager headquartered in Switzerland. It has been around for more than 16 years now in the impact space. And the purpose is to mobilize capital for emerging markets in private debt and private equity. And we operate in more than 70 countries, 300 companies, mostly with non-listed companies. It's quite an important point. And we are very sector thematic. Our sectors are financial inclusion, where we come from, sustainable agribusiness, and obviously climate finance. And maybe as for myself, and to give you a bit also of background and context, I've been 25 years, well, actually 30 years now in the financial sector, including 12 years in impact investment with responsibility. And I have seen actually both sides, investees and investors, because for more than 10 years, I was actually on the origination side of things. So identifying companies we would like to finance, sourcing, originating transactions, mostly in the financial inclusion space, but also in green lending. But more recently, I was also I became in charge of investor relationship in the Asia Pacific region. So I see as well the investors' reaction. And we can provide them solutions through our 15 existing products, but also new structures. So to come back to your point, and as the previous speaker from IFC mentioned, there are currently several responses, right, which are linked to the COVID-19 crisis. I think generally the climate topic I mean, was already very important, will become even more important in the future, as also a response to the COVID crisis. And one of the initiatives that Responsability is coordinating closely with several partners, donors, foundations, includes to support companies that are currently facing a liquidity crisis and reinforce the market foundation. So it includes actually several dimensions. And maybe I start not really with the financing, but with the technical assistance, because it's clearly the crisis also demonstrates the need for organizational support. And it can translate into some technical assistance, and it can take many dimensions, right? It can be, as mentioned before, liquidity planning, but it could be as well business modeling. It could be anything ranging from the investor relation to, for example, credit risk management. And it's actually key for a sector which is still relatively nascent. Obviously, it includes as well financial assistance and liquidity support. And important point, it's an activity which is led with other partners, so it's really a sector response.
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting that the impact funds industry comes and actually provides a kind of a combined response rather than a single fund approach, which could actually bring about a difference here. And also, of course, I suppose with regards to allowing flexibility with payments, it brings about away the competition and pressure from stakeholders. So thank you very much for that, Maud. I'd like to ask Dr. Guo-Puyan briefly, an introduction, briefly, I would say a COVID response seen in China, a stimulant response, but also I'd like to touch the next kind of question, and that is what instruments or if you can elaborate on which ways that green finance is in fact promoted in China, either through the banking sector or otherwise green bonds. And I will have a follow-up question on that, so please go ahead. Yeah.
Thanks, Jose. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Pei Yuan. I am based in Beijing, and I'm the chairman of Sintao Green Finance, and we provide ESG data that cover Chinese Asia. And we also provide green bond verification. We are the CBRI verified partner in China. And we also provide some policy advisory with regard to climate finance and ESG. So I'm glad to be here. Since Joseph asked a great question, but it covered a lot, so I will start with 2 points. Point number one is also a comment on the COVID-19. Point number two, it's a brief historical review of Chinese green finance development. For the COVID-19, I think right now I'm based in Beijing, and the situation here, it's getting much better now. So basically, we come back to work, even though not all the company come back to work, but my company, all our staffs come back to work with reasonable protection of ourselves. And there also a discussion on the so-called sustainable recovery here. I think the key things or the key policy suggestions are 2 things. One is that during this sustainable recovery, we should encourage green investment, which means that we invest in some renewable energy, green infrastructure like high-speed trade, etc. And second is to take care of the environmental and social risk in other typical investment projects, like the typical infrastructure projects. And these are the discussion right now in China on sustainable recovery. another point about green finance. I have been working on this field for over 15 years. So right now, when talking about green finance, people talk about ESG, green bond, etc. And actually, 10 years ago, in China, people talk about green credit, which means that the banks, particularly the commercial banks, should consider the environment and social risk when they lend their money to the clients. And green credit policy actually started in China from 2007 and 2008. And then it became a guideline in 2012 that was the so-called green credit guideline, also with the support of IFC. So thanks IFC. And this actually played a major role because even now, the banking sector actually represents around 70% of the corporate financing in China. So you can see the importance of green credit in China. And also, I think it's actually built a very great fundamental base for green finance development in the past few years. For instance, the so-called taxonomy or category topic. It's an important topic now, particularly in Europe, and it has been a topic for China for around 8 years. So after Chinese regulator released the green credit guideline in 2012, the next question at the time we were discussing is to do the statistic. And therefore we have to have the standard and the category. And that's what we call the taxonomy issues. And therefore I think the work we did at the time for the banking sector actually create some positive experience in for the current development of green finance. And of course, after 2014, we can see that the green finance has been expanded from the banking sector to green bond market to ESG. So right now, I can see that we have a very promising development here in China. And we will expect more development in the next few years.
No, thank you very much. And I think the importance of the banking sector in China and kind of how it evolved from a banking sector in a way I was about to touch that. So thank you very much for covering it. I think it's very kind of important to realize the background and how how the green finance in China has actually evolved to what it is now. I'd like to touch, to maybe ask Pushkala with regards to structures and putting together innovative structures for green finance in the region. Maybe you can describe examples of innovative ideas or structures that recently has been put together. What are the challenges and how can you actually pull in the private sector finance to join on that? So not only being a DFI or a kind of activity, but rather actually bringing together the private sector. So thank you.
Thank you, Yossi. I guess there's a couple of different ways that I'd like to address that question. I think firstly, I work a lot with financial institutions. I'm part of the FIG group in IFC. And so my clients are financial institutions across the region. And of course, we also work with NBFIs, with microfinance. And in every country, every banking sector and every private sector player is quite different. So a lot of what we have done is basically trying to customize solutions or find structures that work in particular countries. And in this regard, with the green bond market, with Dr. Guo and what he mentioned earlier as well, IFC pioneered a lot or created the markets for green bonds. And in this region as well, we started with the Philippines green bond with BDO about 2 years ago. And ever since then, we've done quite a lot, I would say, of activity in the area of green bonds. And this has been a really, I would say, very interesting evolution just in the last 2 years of seeing the size of the green bonds, the kind of assets that get covered, and also the importance, of course, of following standards or principles, because both investors and issuers need to be sure about where the investments are going towards. So I think that's a very important part of what has come out of that. So I think green bonds and the whole capital markets piece has been very interesting, and stemming from that, of course, we've had also loans, which also now have a similar foundation to the green bond principles. So they also follow the same in terms of standardization reporting, which has been very good for the market overall. And I think when, early on when we started out with climate finance, a lot of what we were seeing was around risk share facilities, where we would do, say, first loss structures. And this was also interesting in terms of, especially China, where we had a huge program for energy efficiency, and it helped kind of kickstart the entire climate financing area in a very, very big way. And we're similarly starting to see across Asia as well, be it green bonds, green loans, RSF, or even, as I mentioned earlier, it could be working capital facilities or trade. As long as the use of proceeds goes towards green, we would be very interested to kind of take that further. And that's how we've been working on structures as well. So where it makes sense to do trade, where it makes sense to do, say, a green bond instrument or an RSF, different countries are different in this region. And we've been working based on what's required by clients or what actually proves the impetus to get it going. And so there's a lot of innovation all the time. And I think even within capital markets, we're just at the, I would say, tip of the iceberg. There's still a lot more that we can do. We have still a number of markets in this region where we haven't done any green bonds, for instance. And it also, I think, stems to the fact that there needs to be a capital market side development as well. And so we do a lot also on that aspect in terms of developing capital markets and then bring in the kind of the green or climate finance angle. I would say, I think one of the, so apart from the BDO transaction, which was our first green bond in East Asia, which was really a landmark transaction, and it was about $150 million. We've also done subsequently green bonds in Indonesia, but I think the one in Thailand was very unique as well with TMB, which was an SME green bond. So some part of the proceeds went towards SME and some part went towards green. And I think that was one of the areas that we're trying to see how we can crowd in a lot more private sector investors or private investors is in the area of SME financing. So not only climate, but also there are a large pool of smaller projects or smaller investors or smaller companies that form a very large part of critical mass of what we have in Asia. So I think there's still a lot to be done, as I said, and it's just the beginning of it. But I think we've been pioneering a number of these which have been very innovative. And it's not only pioneering in terms of financial products, it's also in terms of climate assets. I think that's important to mention as well. So a lot of what we've seen, as you can imagine, is renewable energy, which is, I think, in line with what we saw in terms of policy and regulation, and kind of the market followed that because it made sense. And now it's become a very mature area for climate finance. And we want to be able to see the other areas also come up to the same level. So energy efficiency, climate smart agriculture, green buildings and green housing. So there are a number of other asset categories as well that we are trying to develop. And it's not only, I would say, on the financial product side.
Thank you very much, Pushkala. I think you touched some very important aspects, of course, that we perhaps will also touch later. Also with regards to reporting and impact, and I think IFC, I would like to elaborate on that. And with regards to the standards and the use of proceeds, there is involvement on that front with the responsibility bonds principle just issued, which kind of looks at a different way of looking with rather use of proceeds to, in fact, working with KPIs along the lines of green loans. So this is, the market is evolving on that front. Capital markets development, of course, is, as you mentioned, key. And of course, I'm glad you mentioned it because it is all very well and nice, but how can we actually offer developing Asia green assets? We can work with financial hubs, but we do need a vibrant capital markets in developing Asia to actually bring in serious funds. And of course, with climate assets, a lot of these being touched, renewable energy and clean energy, yes, but how do we actually reach those areas that so much need of this capital? So I really thank you for bringing up all of these issues. I'd like to actually ask Maud to also elaborate on the maybe innovative approach that for bringing finance, then that responsibility would actually bring to the market. And also you've mentioned that you are also in charge of working with investors, of course. So how can you, I mean, part of the climate package is bringing those institutional investors to those economies. So how are you convincing, how are you working with European investors and bring them to actually to Asian markets and to climate finance in Asia and the work that you do? Thank you.
Thank you, Youssef. And actually, I would argue that the main question is not so much the European or US investor, it's more Asian investors that are part of the tricky part, but we can address that later. I just would like to come back to what Pushkala said. I think she said something very important. She mentioned the word customized solution. And I think it's a key part on both sides, investors and investees. I mean, obviously, when it comes to investors, and if I look back to the title of the webinar, which is Unlock Hidden Pocket of Finance, I think the question is not so much that they are hidden pocket of finance. It's more to unlock them and to unlock them with a product and structuration that makes sense. Depending on the needs of investor and the type of investor and their appetite when it comes to risk return. And just to elaborate on this customization, it's also true when it comes to green lending and energy efficiency. You don't address with the same solution from an investment perspective, markets which are at very different stage of development with very different needs. So now to come back to your question, Youssef, what does responsibility do in this field? So as an asset manager, we manage funds, and basically we have two specific funds related to climate finance. One is actually celebrating 10 years, and it's about energy efficiency, and it's about deploying finance through banks and large microfinance institutions that would allow to finance energy efficient product and reduce eventually CO2 emission. And so far, it's a fund which has financed more than 75,000 projects through 40 institutions across 25 countries. And it's 10 years, so you could say it's not new, but I think it was quite innovative when given that it was one of the first fund structured in tranches. Allowing as well a cushion for private investors. And it was started by the German Ministry of the Environment and KfW, but others joined, including IFC. Thank you, IFC. So the structure from an investor perspective, it's blended finance, so you have different tranches, junior, mezzanine, senior, etc. And it caters for the need of different investors. Typically, the junior tranche, it's for the initiators and sponsor of the project, it's a catalytic part of the fund. And then the more you move up to the structure, you will find DFI and then private investors at the top of the waterfall. And what does it finance? It's long-term financing, senior or subordinated debt for banks or partner microfinance institutions or financial institutions that commit to finance projects that will reduce CO2. So it's mostly energy efficiency. And very important, and I think sometimes it's not mentioned enough in blended finance solution, technical assistance. It's very important actually when it comes to green lending, simply because, as said earlier, also by the speakers, the stages of development and understanding on solutions may really be very different from country to country. And that's where technical assistance is very important to support the financial institutions in this journey. And it can be used, for example, to help them identify projects they have already in their portfolio and it could be actually developed because they contribute already to CO2 reduction, but it can also help them to do market assessment to identify potentialities. and I could give you example if you want, taken from our portfolio, but typically if you look, it really ranges from, let's say, financing energy efficiency projects in the ready garment sector in Bangladesh, to hybrid car in Sri Lanka, to tuk-tuk, energy efficient tuk-tuk in Cambodia. I chose this example because I'm not sure whether we will go on vacation, right, over summer. Not me and probably not you. So if you project yourself in Cambodia right now, either in Phnom Penh or Siem Reap, if you have been there, you know that most of the transportation actually is done by vehicles which are relatively polluting, and the number of vehicles is increasing as well. And one of the areas that was identified by one of our partners, which is actually a large microfinance institution, is that there are more energy efficient solutions when it comes to tuk-tuk, LPG actually fueled vehicles, which could contribute to energy efficiency. But there was a lot of work done on the technical assistance side, first to assess really the business case, right? Because it must be a win-win situation, right, for the institution, but also for the client, and we must be sure as well that it reduces effectively CO2. So to time, baseline studies, etc. But eventually, we found out that it was very, efficient on the energy saving side, but also for the client, leading to significant fuel costs. So that's one way of engaging into climate finance. The other way we do have, it's a more recent initiative. Actually, it's a fund we closed early this year. And it's to address a different aspect of climate finance. First one was energy efficiency. This one is more about access to clean finance, because you may know, and I think Pushkala also alluded to it, you have at least more than 1 billion people who don't have access to power grid, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Asia Pacific. And I think to figure what it means, you just have to imagine a life where you don't have access to a reliable source of clean energy. You may have to use kerosene for light or kerosene for your energy. And as you can imagine, it has a lot of impact on your ability to conduct a business, on health, and on education of children as well. Still, there are solutions. For individuals, it's all about solar lanterns and solar panels. For small companies, it's more rooftop solar. And that's what we have been trying to address. And here, again, blended finance is very useful because you can create funds, again, with a structure in tranches, each tranche being really suitable for different categories of investors, government, but also DFI, but also foundation, impact funds, family offices, which all have different expectations in terms of risk return. But in our case, we could also build on an existing pilot that we started early to understand more the business model. So to come back to your first point, Youssef, which was really innovative structure, it's really about designing structures that make sense for investors, and government and DFI play a very important role as well to bring catalytic capital and help really start this initiative. Technical assistance is very important as well to speed up the process and really create an ecosystem, if you want. And remaining the question, and maybe we can discuss it here, the next challenge is really how to bring more Asian investors into this space. And I really would like to have the view of my co-panelists here as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Maud. And how do we bring the investors, the Asian investors? I think we also will touch the issue of ESG, of impact measurement. In many cases, investors would say, yes, that is a good idea, but what is the impact? What are the ESG? Where can you show us? Can you actually bring the results? And I just want to give a quote here from the chairman of the US SEC from last week, which is quite difficult quote, but he says that while he believes that in many cases, one or more E issues, S issues, or G issues are material to an investment decision, he has not seen circumstances where combining an analysis of E, S, and G together across a broader range of companies, for example, with a single rating or score, would facilitate meaningful investment analysis that was not significantly over-inclusive and imprecise. What is, I will maybe refer that to Pei-Yuan. I mean, what is maybe your reaction to this? And in general, can you describe how do we put the ESG criteria to actually provide this transparency for investors?
Thank you. I think the discussion went well, and we touched two very important and fundamental issues. One is standard or definition, another is long-term investor. It's not just about investor, it's about long-term investor. And also, I think most of the investors still care about market return. So if you ask them whether you care about ESG, then they will ask whether E or S or G or ESG as a whole will create some difference in my financial return. So I think these are two critical points for everybody, for this community. According to the China experience, I think on the standard or definition, it's quite important to make the alignments. And I think maybe some of you already noticed that 2 weeks ago, our central bank announced a new standard for green bond for public consultation. And in this version, actually, the market actually welcomed this new version, even though it's still not the final version. It's a version for public consultation, but the market welcomed this, not just domestic market, but also global market for two reasons. One is that this proposed standard align the two domestic standards. So in the past 5 years on Chinese green bond market, there are two standards. One is standard by central bank. One is standard by the so-called NDRC, China National Development and Reform Commissions. And therefore you may need to compare to two. So now you can only compare to one. But there's still another standard for green credit. So we still have something to do more, but at least we have a major step. And the global market welcomed the standard because it removed the green use of coal. Because many investors, if they said that we are green investor and we are investing in green bond, and maybe that means to them that we don't want to invest in green, in coal. But in China, according to our energy strategy, we categorize clean use of coal as clean energy. So in this version, we remove green coal. So this actually is also an alignment. So I think for the standard and definition, it's quite important to make the alignment. For the investor's perspective, particularly long-term investor in China, I can see the asset management firms are now showing more interest to ESG, largely because they see some foreign investors are considering these issues when they invest in Chinese A shares. So there are two things quite important. One is how we can bring in more international investors. So this goes back to the standard issues. So that's one. Another is how we can mobilize the domestic investors. We also have pension, we also have insurance assets. But the point is that they are now used to the traditional business model and the investment opportunity, investment projects, and they lack of knowledge on the so-called new projects. And therefore, I think just like Pushkala said, organization like IFC, how they can structure some model. For example, First Lux sharing scheme or structure that can encourage the traditional investor in the market to take a try to test this new idea. I think it worked. At least it worked in the past 10 years. in China for IFC on the energy efficiency project. So I think similar scheme may be useful for ESG investment or climate finance, green finance in general. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this. And I think that now we are entering the Q&A section. But maybe a takeaway from Pei-Yuan comments. The transition requires adaptation to the transition, and structures like a first loss to educate investors could make the change. And until we are actually there to get acquainted with the products, and they can take off. So I'd like to, on that note, I'd like to maybe just say that we've touched many issues here, that including capacity building, referred to by Maud and Pushkala, and many other issues that could actually make it happen for green structure products in the region. Of course, we have a limited time, but we will touch a few Q&A questions referred from the actually participants. And I'd like to refer the first question to Pushkala. And the question is actually, can you expand on the areas that still needs to be developed, green housing, etc., and in which priority is IFC working on these? And basically, and how the difference, how are the differences being addressed by the different products, basically? How does IFC address the different opportunities?
Thank you, Yossi. I guess, I'd like to also tie this question back to what everyone has said, Dr. Guo, Maud, and you. So I think IFC also plays a very similar role in terms of not only the investor side, but we're also an issuer, we're also on the technical assistance side. And I think it's all these things are really needed if you look at climate finance as a whole. So Maud was very right when she said that you have to look at it as a package, you have to look at it as a comprehensive one, and you also have to look at it from a monitoring and impact perspective, as Dr. Guo rightly said. So having said that, when we are looking at newer sectors in terms of climate assets, we're also taking these into account. So for example, as I mentioned earlier, yes, renewables is definitely now mainstream, but there are certain aspects within renewables, for instance, rooftop solar or distributed generation, which is not as advanced or as mature yet, and probably is needed more in Asia than anywhere else, maybe Africa as well. But taking this as an example, what IFC would do in this space would be, say, three things. So it could be on the technical assistance side in terms of developing the capacity, developing guidelines, developing quality frameworks around this, which could be helpful for the market or investors. Also capacity building with FIs and corporates who would want to do projects in this area. It would also be making some of these first investments or pioneer investments, as we talked about. It could be first loss, could be RSF, could be a blended finance product. But the third part of it is crowding in investors over some period of time so that it then becomes a sustainable asset class or a product class on its own. So in terms of priority, right now, taking all these factors into consideration, we think rooftop solar and distributed generation is definitely a very big piece in terms of priority. We are also looking at green housing, as I mentioned, and green affordable housing and green buildings, because of course, most of the emissions that we see, it comes from buildings and transportation. So transportation is another third area that we're looking at very closely in terms of EV, but also in terms of public transport and greening transport and infrastructure. And the other piece, which is important, of course, is climate smart agriculture. So agriculture, as you know, is also a very large part of a number of different economies and markets, especially in Asia. And there's a lot happening in CSA that we're doing internally to see where we could bring in investors, where the impact could be, and how it could really help in terms of climate. And to a point that was made earlier, which I think is very relevant, not only for IFC, but for a number of investors and issuers in this market, a lot has been done in mitigation. And we can see now a shift towards adaptation as well, and how to make adaptation scalable, how to make adaptation feasible commercially and interesting for investors, but at the same time, ensuring that there's impact and ensuring that there's additionality in what's being done. Thank you, Yossi.
Thank you very much, Pushkala. Before I move to the next question, I'd like to introduce the AVPN team to introduce a poll to the audience to answer. And so, yes, okay. While you are responding, I'd like to introduce the next question to maybe as a follow-up to this question. Can you actually, and maybe I'll propose a mode to answer the question. Can you actually see nature-based solutions as a form of climate finance in Asia? And Pushkala spoke about climate smart agriculture and the move to adaptation. But going forward to a nature-based solutions or structures, related structures, have you seen any evolvement, such evolvement in the region?
Yes, hi. I see the question comes from Annie. So hi, Annie, from Hong Kong. Look, yes, absolutely. I can see it in the sense that, look, I'm sure there is a broad-based answer to what are nature-based solutions. But let's say if we take it as generally biodiversity, it's obviously one of a key topic. I know many DFIs are working on it. Maybe Pushkala, you would like to say a word also about it. I think the question is really how to make it, as we are speaking here in an impact investment, forum, how to make it a solution suitable for impact investment. And I think it's really a big question, right? So I don't know, Pushkala, if you want to say a word, because I know IFC has done some work on biodiversity as well and nature-based solutions.
Yes, absolutely. No, I think you've covered most of what I wanted to, or what I was thinking of as well. I think it's a very new area, a very niche area, but I think I think the point that you made, Maud, is very, very important, which is that in a lot of these newer areas that are coming in, we need to ensure that it's transparent, it's clear in terms of what the use of proceeds are going towards, how it's being monitored, where is the impact coming from, because I see this very often a question from investors as well. As we see more and more climate finance coming to the market, it's also a question of, yes, that's fine, but are we really sure that there's no greenwashing? Are we really sure that this is what it's intended to do? And I think with a number of these newer areas in adaptation and nature-based solutions, biodiversity, it's very important when we go in to build that confidence in the market, to build it as we go, because I think this is one thing that the Green Bonds has done very well with the principles and the standards. And now, of course, as Dr. Guo said, in China as well. So I think there's this growing realization that there are a number of different paths to climate finance, nature-based solutions being one of them, and we're also looking at it, of course. But I think we're also focusing a lot on the impact measurement, monitoring, and building that kind of confidence amongst investors and issuers.
Mm-hmm. I think it's very true. And on that note, if I just come back to what Pushkala said, I mean, we discussed already ESG, but if we take, I mean, I think we should also come back to what do we mean really, right? By saying what we want with ESG. And I think one of the approach is really to look at ESG as a risk management framework as well, right? Where you identify the risk linked to your investment. And of course, I'm speaking for what I know, private debt and private equity investment, but you look at the risk that are linked to environment, to possible, let's say, deviation from low labor typically. And you do it not only because you want to avoid the risk of reputation or because you want to exclude certain things, but also because from an investment perspective, you can give a lot of value added to your investment. And the way we look at it, it's really about defining a roadmap, right? IFC actually has done a great work into defining the operating principle for, and it's very useful, right? Because you can engage with your investees, define the risk, area of improvement, and look at it in a certain timeline. And actually, Pushkala, you were mentioning greenhouses at one point. A reason why, and particularly in renewable energy, that's really an area we should have a strong look into it. You have every day basically articles on risk linked to poor planning or poor construction in the renewable energy space, and so something that the industry should really have a look into. And a way of doing it, of course, is to put it as essential part of the due diligence process, right? Either yourself, if you have structure to do it, or hire consultant who can specifically look at the E and S risk of investment. That's one. And we have not so much talked about impact, but I think on the impact space, there have been a lot of progress done when I compare to how it was 12 years ago when I started in this space. And you have now a very strong methodology, robust framework. So it's all about adapting it, obviously, and using it. If you want to see what we do, for example, I really encourage you to have a look at our impact report, where we use a set of indicators and we systematically ask our investees to report on them, and we produce a report. And I think it's really important to actually build trust and transparency in the industry.
Thank you very much. I think the ESG as a risk metric for investors is very important in a way, kind of maybe similar to kind of TCFD's work with the financial system, identifying the risk. But when you're talking on investments, private sector or impact investments, it is a very interesting, of course, element. And of course, the impact measurement, capacity building, a lot to elaborate there. I'd just like to touch one more question that I would like to refer to Pei Yuan. And that also has to do a lot with SEI's work in the region based in Bangkok. We look into ways of how diverse stakeholders, impact investors, asset managers, financial institutions, mostly private sector, but diverse stakeholders within the private sector work together, also with philanthropic organizations, also with policymakers, in order to create new structure, a new dialogue. And as I mentioned, we are working in Bangkok on a center to actually facilitate such discussions. And of course, with great collaboration with the, I think, AVN platform, which is key for those to initiate those discussions. And so just answering that perspective and building on that question, where do you see maybe the philanthropic family office role in these structures or in these discussions? Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. That's not an easy question. I have 2 points. One is that you mentioned there are a number of different players in the market, and I think it is true. And according to my observation, particularly based in the Chinese context, we also have this variety of different players in this so-called ESG or green finance or climate finance community. One key thing is that we need to enhance the role of the regulators, and I think this is particularly true in emerging markets like Asia, including China. And I also have some work with some regulators in the Asia region with regard to green finance policy. And I can see that the regulator policy should play a significant role. This is point number one. And point number two about the family office, etc. In China, I think this is just starting. The reason is quite simple, because the rich family, the new rich family grows in the past 20 years. So still the first generation. And you know, the first generation businessmen focus a lot on the business. Even when they are 70, 80, they're still on the front lines of their business. And the opportunity will come for the second generation, because I see many cases that the second generation feel like they want a whole completely new road for their life. and new business model. So they just don't want to repeat what their parents did in the past decades. And therefore, I think this will be a future opportunity, how we can build a community for the second generation and mobilize the family wealth that they accumulated in the past few decades. At least this is the case in China. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much. And I can now refer to the, we are summing up, so I can refer to the maybe poll results of the question posted. So the AVPA, thank you very much. We see shifting to renewable energy is the winner here. But we have many other issues to be dealing. Sustainable fishing, agriculture doesn't come here at kind of, let's say, as the main response, but it does have a significant effect on population, perhaps not less on emissions, but more on the livelihood and adaptation resilience of many of the region's communities. I would like to thank all the panelists, distinguished panelists, and would like to maybe give you a 30 kind of second sum up for this discussion. So we start with Maud, please.
Look, I think we touched on several topics. One, we could have developed more probably its impact measuring and reporting, but it will be for next session next year, hopefully in person. I think one of the key takeaway for me from this session is to see the variety of approach, right? But still with very key principles, which are, well, obviously to look for in the investable market, define solutions that work for different type of investors, and building on transparency and comparability. I think that was one of the key words touched upon during the session.
Thank you. Pushkala, please.
Thank you very much, Yossi. This is really excellent. And thank you very much to AVP and again, Yossi and Dr. Guo and Maud. I think it was a very exciting session and so many different opinions, but I think we're all aligned in terms of certain key messages. Climate is a huge opportunity, especially for Asia, and an important one. It's not, I think, merely just something that people do as a one-off anymore. It's a business that's scalable, it can be replicated, it makes sense, and more important than anything else, it's the need of the hour, really, from what we see with COVID, and we're probably going to have a climate crisis if we don't do anything pretty soon. Clearly, there's a lot of intent in the market, there's a lot of intent amongst investors, issuers, and various organizations to make it happen. So I think there are avenues, regardless of how small or how large the project is, there is an access to finance that's available now. And as Maud rightly said, a lot of it is also technical assistance, impact measuring, doing it for the right reasons and doing it in a transparent and credible way. Because once you do that, then it builds confidence in the market for it to be more sustainable and for others to come in as well. So thank you very much, Yossi.
Thank you, Pushkala. P1, please, last word.
Thanks, Yossi, and great to join this panel discussion. And I think the discussion it's great. And what I want to say is that we just make a tiny step of a long journey. So there are a lot to do. Particularly, I realized that according to the survey we did at the beginning, quite a lot of foundation here in this meeting. And I would suggest that in this region in Asia, focus on two.
On that note, sorry, it seems like the screen has frozen for Dr. Guo, but we've come to the end of the session anyway. Thank you, Yossi, so much for your excellent moderation. Maud, Dr. Push, Dr. Guo, thank you for this excellent session. Thank you to all our listeners for the active participation. I see we have a number of questions in the Q&A pod that haven't been answered, and we will pass those on to the panelists, and they should be able to respond to you directly. And you can also reach them with the AVPN Connector app to connect and to ask the questions directly. Before we end the session, also the chat box is open, so please feel free to write in the poll window below. Write about any key takeaways from the session, any action points you're planning on taking. We've now come to the end of the session, which was made possible with the kind support of our lead partners, Stockholm Environment Institute, Chandler Foundation, and Udan Prize Foundation, and our knowledge partner, WOCAN. As I said, please continue chatting with your speakers and fellow delegates at this session. Do share the highlights of this on social media, and remember to tag us using the hashtag AVPN2020. Please also look at the COVID pledge on our conference website. We also have a prototype online platform, learning platform, AVPN Academy at academyavpn.asia. We would love to hear your feedback on how we can take this platform forward. We would also be happy to explore collaboration opportunities to create new courses and content for AVPN community. We have a number of events coming up for impact funds and family offices. So please link on to our events page. And as my colleagues in the earlier sessions have mentioned, there's an AVPN climate action platform. And yesterday we launched the gender platform. So please use those to connect and keep learning in this space. In the meantime, please join us for the next session on empowering green solutions towards a climate safe future with AVPN's DealShare Live, which starts at 4 p.m. We look forward to seeing you there. Thank you so much.